contributions to the Institute in some way, or are going to tell us about some of the contributions that came out of ISI. So we're going to start with Dr. George Becky, who I think a lot of people know already, but he was the person that brought Unkerford here to ISI and to USC. So George is an authority on robotic research and applications, is known for his scientific achievements, broad technological perspective, and humanistic approach. A member of the National Academy of Engineering, George is a former Associate Dean for Research in USC Viterbi School of Engineering. He chaired the Department of Electrical Engineering, the Department of Computer Science, and founded the Biomedical Engineering Department. George also chaired the search committee that hired Herb Shore 23 years ago. So George is 2 for 2 on hiring good people, right? We should put you on this search committee. He is a USC professor, the university's highest academic honor, a recipient of the USC Presidential Medallion. George's 55-year career spans robotics, biomedical engineering, and dynamic system modeling. He is currently an advisor to the Dean of the Engineering at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Good thing they don't have a football team, among other roles. So the author and co-author of nearly 250 journal articles, 20 book chapters, 9 books. He most recently edited the Robotics Ethics, the Ethical and Social Implications of Robotics. Please welcome George Becky.
There's a stool for short guys, but I think I'll try to get along without it. Oh, good. The projector is here. Can you get the full screen on it? Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right, so thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to try to recount the story going back to the beginning before the beginning, in some sense. We're celebrating the 40th anniversary, which takes us back to 1972. I'd like to tell you some of the background going back to 1952, which is another 20 years earlier. And I was probably the sole witness to all these events that occurred at some of this place. But on the other hand, most of the people I didn't know. So anyway, what I'd like to do then is to go back first to 1946. 1946, this is where most of us were not born yet, and you know, this was the year when John von Neumann began building the IAS machine at Princeton. This was the computer at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where he was a member of the faculty, along with such other notables as Albert Einstein and Kurt Gödel and others. But it's interesting that almost at the same time, the fellow on the right-hand side, whose name is Willis Ware, was getting out of the service in 1946. And he was intrigued by these newfangled machines called computers, and he had heard about the project at Princeton, so he wrote a letter to von Neumann, and he got hired, so fresh out of the service. And he spent 5 years working on the von Neumann machine. This, as you know, is usually touted as being the first machine with stored program architecture, which we usually refer to as the von Neumann architecture. There may have been predecessors elsewhere. Some people claim that Turing proposed the idea, but well, let's let von Neumann stay with the honor. But as you will see, at least Willis Ware has a major role in what happened later. Okay. So now, let me skip forward. In 1952, Willis Ware left from Princeton and joined the RAND Corporation. And RAND, of course, was the organization from which ISI was born. I had just finished my master's degree at UCLA, and I was in charge of the mechanical differential analyzer. The story that I'm telling you actually involves 2 computers and 11 people, and you've already seen 2 of them, so there are 9 more to go. But the machine, and this was one which I'm sure most of you have not seen. It looked like this. This was a mechanical analog machine, predecessor to electronic analog computers. The analogy was not a voltage, but a shaft rotation. So you had to count shaft rotations to know the value of a particular variable. And on the left-hand side, you see those motors. Each of those is sitting on top of a box, which is in fact a electromechanical integrator. So that machine will produce the integral of x dy, and x and y could be any variables whatsoever. The machine was about 20 feet long, so it's a very large machine, and it had extremely long solution times. I mean, there were times when we ran it overnight. But we had contracts from industry in those days, including we were the first computer that was used by Aerojet to compute the trajectory of the Aero B, which was one of the first rockets that went to the edge of space. So it was actually a very remarkable machine, and if we have time, I can tell any of you about some of the secrets of and foibles that occurred in running a mechanical computer like this. Now, at that time, in 52 to 54, I had three guys working for me, Ed DeLand, Tom Ellis, and Malcolm Davis. I couldn't find a picture of Malcolm Davis himself, and Davis, I understand, has had a stroke and lives in San Diego, and I couldn't find a picture. But Tom Ellis and Ed DeLand were key members of the staff running this particular machine, okay? And both of them had very important roles to play in how ISI came to USC, okay? And you'll see them both shortly. So now, in the period from 1952 to 62, Willis Ware was now at RAND, and he was responsible for the construction of JONIAC. This was a copy of the IAS machine, and it stood for John von Neumann Integrating Automatic Computer. And so this machine was being built, and he had the same kind of problems that von Neumann did in trying to get a high-speed memory. Originally, the Princeton machine had a contract with RCA to build high-speed memories in very complex vacuum tubes called selectrons. And each selectron was supposed to be able to store 4,096 10-bit words. The RCA never succeeded in delivering. They were supposed to make 200 of them, and so von Neumann went back to Williams tubes, which are basically CRT tubes, and each of them could only store 256 words. But nevertheless, that's the way it worked for a while, and the same tubes were used at RAND until sometime in the middle of this period when they began to install core memory to replace some of these Williams tubes. Okay? So that was the period. Now, and during this same time, two other things were going on. One is Tom Ellis, who had been working with me at UCLA, was now at RAND developing a device for graphical input into a digital computer. And this was called the RAND tablet. It was, in fact, the forerunner to the Kindle or the iPad or any other tablets that you would like to look at out there. Tom's tablet was 10 inches by 10 inches. And it actually had it used a stylus, just like contemporary ones do, but it had extremely fine resolution. Under the surface, there were 10 wires per inch in the XY direction and 10 wires per inch in the horizontal direction. So actually, over 10 inches, you had 1,000 wires by 1,000 wires, or you could get a resolution of 1 part in a million, which actually for its day was quite remarkable. So this was going on at this time. And then Ed DeLand, the other fellow whose picture you just saw, well, here's the JONIAC, okay? So Ed DeLand had developed a graphical simulation language for biological systems. It was called BioMod. BioMod ran on the JONIAC and was translated into JAWS, which was the JONIAC open shop system language, and from there into machine language. But BioMod was then used to simulate systems, and Ed DeLand, since he knew me and knew I was interested in modeling biological systems, called me and asked if I wanted to consult at RAND and help him simulate the respiratory system on the JONIAC. Okay? So I went there a day a week. We never succeeded in getting the simulation running. However, over a period of a year that I was there, I think we caused the JONIAC to crash at least 50 times. people were accusing me of purposely using commands that would crash the Johnny-Ack. And of course, that was not the case, but nevertheless, this is the machine. And you can see there's a card reader here. Those don't appear in most contemporary machines. But anyway, they did exist. And these tubes would appear, would then be housed in those cabinets in the back. Okay? So again, it's Ed DeLand who invited me to come to RAND. And during the weekly meeting when I was there, that's where I met Keith Unkefer. Willis Ware was the head of the computer science group, or computer systems group at RAND, and his deputy was Keith Unkefer. When Willis left, then Keith took over the group. As you can see, those two guys were very important in this whole process. Okay? And there's our friend Keith Unkefer. He always dressed rather nattily, though I never quite approved of using a checkered tie with a striped shirt. But nevertheless, as you can see, he was a very natty dresser. So let me run through this list of people, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how they fit in then a little bit later. Okay? So you've already met von Neumann and Willis Ware and Keith Unkefer. This is Chauncey Starr, who at the time was the Dean of Engineering at UCLA. Okay? His counterpart is here. That's Zorab Kaprillian, Dean of Engineering at USC. Okay? This gentleman here is Bob Balzer, who was Keith's right-hand man, and we're fortunate to have Bob with us. So those of you who haven't met him, raise your hand, Bob. So those of you who haven't met him will have a chance to... one of the real pioneers in this whole business. Now, Zorab Kaprillian, through this period in the early 1970s, was also vice president of the university. And so he had no time to be dean, even though he carried the title. So what he did instead, he installed his buddy, Jack Mnuchin. These two guys met as graduate students at Berkeley. And Mnuchin would sit in the dean's office without a title. But because Mnuchin and Kaprillian owned a house in Bel Air, what would happen was that Mnuchin would handle all the paperwork, but if there were any questions that needed the dean's input, he would take them home in the evening, ask Kaprillian, and come back in the morning with the answer. The kind of unusual system of operation, but that's the way it went. Okay? So now you've been introduced to all of them, and so let me get you the rest of the story. So as I mentioned already, Ed DeLand was at RAND. The Biomod was a high-level language. In 1963, Tom Ellis demonstrated the RAND tablet, and there are a series of patents dated from the early 1960s. Okay, now there was another event that occurred in the early 1970s. It's already been mentioned at our lunch today. This gentleman is usually associated with a set of documents called the Pentagon Papers. A series of documents detailing United States involvement in the Vietnam War. And so Daniel Ellsberg got hold of these papers and released them to the New York Times. This did not make him very popular either with the White House or with the Pentagon, as you can imagine. So there were a series of meetings, and there are a number of interpretations about what happened to RAND funding at that time. The most believable interpretation that I saw was that RAND funding was reduced by 20%, but it was not uniform. It was 20% across the board, but much more in the technology areas. And basically, because it was an FFRDC, this was a federally funded research and development center, they couldn't go to industry or elsewhere to get new money. Okay? So it was probably reduced by at least 50% in the technology areas like the computers. So Bob Balzer received a number of offers, and he was ready to leave. Keith Unkefer was toying with the idea of going to San Diego and starting a private company, somehow allied with BB&N, Bolt, Brannick, and Newman. And then there were a number of discussions also about the possibility of starting an institute affiliated with the university. I think it's Bob Balzer who really convinced Keith that the university was the right place to go. However, that it was terribly important to get an institute that's housed off campus rather than on the campus. And Bob was right. He said, we're going to grow very rapidly. And if you get space for 3 or 4 people from Rand now at a university, and a year later you want to expand it from 4 to 40, you'll run into nothing but politics at a university. Nothing creates worse university problems than space. And he was right, of course. Those of you who are at the university will understand all this. So anyway, by 1972, then, this is 40 years ago now, so Keith decided to leave the camp, to leave Rand. And meanwhile, he already had conversations with Larry Roberts and Steve Lukasik and others at DARPA, who basically told him that if he started a separate institute allied with the university, they would fund him. So so what happened then is he first approached Chauncey Starr, whose picture you saw before. Starr basically said it was a great idea and it would take him at least 15 months to get through the university hierarchy, including Sacramento, to do this. And Keith replied something to the effect, I don't have 15 days. And so that didn't happen. He called Irvine, the same thing across the University of California system. So then that left USC, and then he remembered that he knew me, and I was the only USC person he knew. Okay? So because I had worked in his group. So he called me. Okay? And then everything happened during this 1 week, beginning with April 17th in 1972. So on Monday, Keith called me and asked, I remember his words almost exactly, he said, do you think USC would be interested in having a research institute in the information sciences? He used those words from the very beginning. So I said, I think so, but let me check. We've got to set up a meeting with the dean. Okay? So I called him back the next morning. And on Tuesday, there was a meeting in my office with Jack Mnuchin, who represented the dean. This is the man you saw, who was the alter dean. And Clark McCartney. We invited Clark because he was head of contracts and grants, and we thought we might need a contracts person. So we met there, and I emphasized to Jack Mnuchin how important this was. I saw this as a historic opportunity. Okay? So there's Caprillion. Those of you who haven't met him, this is the guy who nearly single-handedly transformed USC from a backwater second-rate school into a research-oriented School of Engineering. When I was at UCLA as a graduate student, the standard staying was, don't worry about your grades. If you flunk out of UCLA, you can always go to USC. And fortunately, that has changed. On Wednesday, Mnuchin called Unkefer, having spoken to Caprillion already, and said, would you like to have lunch with Dr. Caprillion? To which, of course, Keith replied, who is Dr. Caprillion? And then they met. They met on Thursday for lunch. They met, those of you who know Westwood, they met at Ship's Coffee Shop in Westwood. Okay? And Caprillion liked the idea, said you have to wait a while. Keith said, but you know, there's a high-rise building that's just opening up in the marina. I think that's where we ought to be because it's 10 minutes from the airport, and that's the right location for us to have a center. And I think I can get a space maybe on a loaner basis. And so Caprillion said, please wait a day or two. We can't do this immediately. And he wasn't convinced about the off-campus location. He wanted to be on campus. So that was on Thursday. You said he needed approval of the trustees. On Friday, Caprillion personally called Caprillion and said, you know, there's a Board of Trustees meeting off campus like they usually do on a Saturday. And I'm going there and I'm going to tell them about their new off-campus center. This was Caprillion's style. If he couldn't get permission, he would just do it. I think today would have been impossible, but in those days he had the bravado to accomplish this. And then he loaned Caprillion $4,000 to buy furniture. So the story is that the next day, on Saturday, Keith, Bob Balzer, and Tom Ellis sat on the shag carpet in their new office on the 12th floor. I understand from Bob Balzer that the reason they wanted 12th floor space because it was closest to the air conditioners on the roof, and therefore air conditioning would be cheaper than if they went further down. So anyway, they wrote a proposal to DARPA for an umbrella contract. In those days, it was still possible to get contracts without specific deliverables. These were called umbrella contracts. And so they wrote a proposal for $6 million. In 30 days, they had $6 million. On Monday, April 24th, Keith Unkefer appeared on the USC payroll. So these were the three brave folks who initially left from RAND to start the Information Sciences Institute. So that's what you saw. I'm very fortunate for me to be a part of the story. And let me just summarize it in 1 minute here. If Willis Ware hadn't come to build the Johnny-Ack at RAND, and if Ed DeLand hadn't brought me in as a consultant, I would not have met Keith Unkefer. And had I not met Keith Unkefer and Bob Balzer, then obviously Keith wouldn't have called me about going to USC. And he was also fortunate that he was turned down by Chauncey Starr, but that Mnuchin and Caprillion succeeded in doing this. And, folks, the rest is history. Let me just... I'd like to take 1 more minute for a postscript, because my involvement with USC, as you just heard in the introduction, actually went beyond this initial period. And in 1987, after Keith Unkefer resigned and went to work with Bob Kahn, Dr. Bob Kahn is here, and he went to work with Bob Kahn at the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, CNRI. Then Silverman, who was by then the Dean of Engineering, asked me to head a search committee for a new director. And because Silverman trusted Unkefer, he basically accepted his suggestions about how to do this. And so we had an extremely small search committee. So there's Silverman on the left and Bob Balzer. So the search committee consisted of myself, Bob Balzer, and Alan Newell from Carnegie Mellon University, one of the great pioneers in artificial intelligence. And there were only 3 of us. It was also one of the few times ever that they used an outside person for an internal search. See? When I talked to the current dean, Dr. Yortzos, about this, he said, we never use outside people for searches. They have to be people within our own institution. So that was the story, and the 3 of us interviewed a number of people. Eventually, someone suggested this fellow, Herbert Shore, at IBM. I didn't know him. Some people had talked to Bob Kahn and knew him. What I did in situations like this, when I didn't know somebody, I called my guru, and that was Ed Feigenbaum at Stanford, and I asked him what he thought about this guy, Shore, and he said, now, there's a guy who would make a good director. So with that, I wanted to find somebody with a big smile, and there he is. And the last word I want to say is that the Becky tradition at ISI continues, because my daughter Michelle is now doing public relations and marketing for ISI, and the programs and the description of ISI that you have received or will receive are all her handiwork. And I can tell you, because I'm staying with her, she was still working on it at midnight last night. Thank you.
So George gave a little introduction, but next we have Dr. Robert Kahn is going to be coming up and speaking. He's the chairman and CEO and president of the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, CNRI, a not-profit organization that provides leadership and funding. We need funding. We should come talk to you. For national information infrastructure research and development. In the 1960s, Bob was an assistant professor of electrical engineering at MIT. He took a leave of absence to join BBN, where he was responsible for systems design of the ARPANET, which you all know as the first packet switching network. In 1972, he moved to DARPA and later became director of DARPA's Information Processing Techniques Office. There he initiated the U.S. government's billion-dollar strategic computing program. Those were the good days, weren't they? The largest computer research and development program ever undertaken. Bob convinced conceived the idea of open architecture networking, co-invented TCP/IP, and originated DARPA's Internet program. He also coined the term National Information Infrastructure, NII, and in the mid-'80s, now widely known as the Information Superhighway. Bob is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of just about everything, and has received more awards, prizes, and honorary degrees than any computer scientist can count. So please welcome Bob Kahn.
Okay, well, thank you for that nice introduction. Let's see, I just have a few comments on what we've heard so far. George, it is amazing with all you've done for ISI, how low-key a role you've played in this whole picture. So I guess from my perspective, I say congratulations to you, but thank you for everything you've done. Second, I really appreciate all those pictures from 40 years ago. And I just want to make one comment. It's amazing. Bob Balzer hasn't changed one iota in 40 years. And then finally, full disclosure, Herb and I have known each other since our days together at Princeton, so I was kind of biased on thinking that USC could use a little bit of Princeton injection into their whole curriculum. Served you well over the years. One other comment, you mentioned that Keith had joined ISI. Again, this is a personal retrospective on what actually happened during that period. So I'll give you my view of that, which is that Keith had stated his intention to step down from ISI, but he was unbelievably reluctant to do that. I mean, it was almost like a dentist that couldn't get this tooth out. As far as Keith was concerned, it was a very healthy tooth. So one of the arrangements that we made was with Len Silverman at the time that we would bring him on. I could only afford him half-time at that time because we were just getting started. Len agreed to bring him on as an associate dean or an assistant dean, you probably remember which, at that time, and pay the other half. And so he was actually on both payrolls for a while, and it was the fact that there were the joint agreements that actually made it work. Keith was never an employee of CNRI. He was always on the USC payroll. I think he wanted to keep his health insurance during that whole period for a variety of reasons. But he spent about 2 weeks in every month at USC. He spent the other 2 weeks at CNRI. I would deign to say that he spent as much time doing ISI business out of CNRI, representing him to the government and the like, and he probably spent, a substantial part of his time at USC doing CNRI kinds of things. So that tended to work out for both of us. And, of course, as you all know, Keith passed away in 2002. I believe it was on a trip back to California. As he was his wont, he used to sometimes go to sleep on the planes, and this time the plane landed, and the stewardesses couldn't awaken him. So that was unfortunate for everyone. But I think part of the reason that Keith was so reluctant to leave ISI in the first place is he just loved the place. And even when Herb was set up, I think we had to put into place something that would have made it easy for him to leave, to actually cause that to complete. So that was sort of my take on that part of the story. I think George told the history of ISI in the early days as well as anyone can. Let me just say from a DARPA perspective, I was very well aware of what was going on at the time, and it was a very good group there that DARPA didn't want to lose. And they were afraid if they split up and all went in different quarters, it wouldn't come together again, and they wanted to be able to build on that nucleus. I don't have the recollection that Willis had left. My recollection was, George, that he had actually stayed, but I could be wrong about that. But in any event, the group that eventually did go to ISI went because DARPA was willing to give them verbal assurances that if they made that move, they would back them. And in those days, that's all it took was somebody's word out of DARPA. The rest of it was just sort of pro forma and bureaucratic. ISI over the years has been a rather remarkable institution, partly due to what Keith created and partly due to what Herb has managed to grow it into over the remaining years. And Herb and I had stayed in pretty close contact during that period. One of the things that contributed, in my opinion, was to show that a university group like this was clearly part of the university, but it wasn't traditional university. That it, in fact, in addition to contributing to research, could support programs in other operational ways. And it's done that over the years. So let me start with the operational side of it and give you a flavor for that. And then I'll get back into some of the research stuff later. And my apologies to people in the room whose work I'm not going to cover. I was asked to focus on networking per se. So I know a lot about what Bob has done over the years. Bob, I'm not going to mention a word of it. So sorry. And also what I know, since this is a personal retrospect, I haven't followed as closely the work that ISI has done in more recent years. So John, my apologies to the work that's going on there. I knew a lot more about what happened earlier, although I know some about what's going on, but I don't need to opine on that right here. ISI continues to contribute in a variety of ways. So let me start with the operational side of things first. ISI has provided interesting examples of operational support that didn't have good counterparts elsewhere in both the networking area, in the computational support area, and in the applications support area. All revolved around DARPA to start with, although it's branched out in subsequent years. I think Keith's view was he wanted to set up ISI as a DARPA shop, kind of one client, and do whatever it took to support that client, and that's what he did for a long time. That was possible for a long time, but I think starting, I would have to guess, in the mid-'80s, it became increasingly clear that was going to become more difficult, and it became almost impossible by the '90s. I'm sure Herb could relate this story to you in gory detail. On the computational side, at the time ISI got started, I think it's fair to say the operating system of choice in the computing community was a Tenex system that had been built at BB&N. Bert was essentially ran the group that built it for quite a while. BB&N was developing the technology, but ISI exploited it in a variety of ways. They ran a major computational facility. I heard you say they started up on the 12th floor, but my recollection is that's where the comp center was when I first saw it. So must have been that you got moved down a floor. Is that a demotion? I'm not sure. Cost more to air condition?
The computer center was up on the 12th floor, but it only occupied part of that. And then we expanded, and then the comp center took over more of it to the offices.
Gotcha. Probably took more air conditioning for the computers than for the people. And in fact, this was a major accomplishment in many ways because not only was it set up to provide computational support to ISI, it was also the major computational support to our offices at DARPA. Not all of DARPA made use of network resources. We were kind of the pioneers in that. In fact, I remember when the decision was made to bring personal computers into DARPA, the administration decided to bring in IBM PCs. IBM PCs in 1981 or 2 had no network capabilities at all. And they said, well, you know, that's fine. You don't need it. Just kind of run around these little floppy disks from floor to floor. We called it SneakerNet. Our office made a different decision. We decided to go with real workstations. And we ended up we ended up bringing in Sun workstations at the time. And I remember these were not very reliable at the time, so we had in the front office of DARPA, if anybody was ever there, it had a couch. Researchers used to sleep on it when they came in early. This was before the days when you had gates and controls and all those things to go through to get in the front door. But we had like 50 monitors just stacked up there. These were these square, black, ugly boxes. That's before Style showed up, sort of like the Model T versus a Thunderbird or an Aston Martin or something. So these were not very pretty, but they kind of blew with great frequency, like every few weeks, once a month. And so we had to have a whole stock of the monitors to swap in and out. But that was what we did, and we were viewed as the anomaly. with one exception. There was one fellow in the office named Steve Squires who thought that was a terrible idea because Apollo had a much better technology. So Steve had one Apollo machine, everybody else in our office had Sun workstations, and the rest of the agency had IBM PCs running around with floppy drives. But in any event, ISI, starting in the mid-'70s, provided this computational support, and DARPA was very comfortable making use of it because ISI was a very trustworthy operation. I mean, in fact, if the bottom line were told today, I would say it was a combination of the qualities of the researchers and the confidence that the DARPA management, right up to the director, had in Keith to keep the place together and working properly. That really made it work. So they were willing to have all their emails go through ISI. There was no encryption, no security, but on the other hand, there weren't that many people on the net either. We weren't in the world of 3 billion people on the internet back then. And pretty much everybody knew everybody by first name. So that was one of the things. So also to put it in perspective, I remember Keith coming to me one time and saying, we need more memory for the ISI machines. He wanted to buy another megabyte. A megabyte, we funded him to buy the megabyte. It cost $1 million for the megabyte. And this megabyte, I would guess, was maybe 8, 10, 12 lineal feet. I mean, it was racks and racks of stuff. 1 megabyte. Today you can get almost a terabyte on one of these little floppy disks, but that's what we were dealing with. Very expensive. But ISI was the place. This is where it all happened. So I just wanted to paint that picture. They did a major thing to make it real to people that not only could operational support on this was the ARPANET back then, be possible, but it could be done reliably and cost efficiently and effectively out of a university kind of setting, where they kept the costs down and so forth. So that was a major contribution in my view. Second of all, they made some major contributions to networking, and the computational part, I put it into the networking pile because this was all over the network. So it was all a contribution to networking in some sense. The networking piece that I'm about to describe is probably more well-known, and I'm not going to go into it in very much detail because I was given advance notice of what Rod was going to say, so I didn't preempt everything on his list, some of which I couldn't have talked about anyway, but because I just don't know. But in fact, ISI started out in the networking field, this is more hardcore networking, as the keeper of the critical records and documentation. But more important than that, it was really the supplier of independent good judgment as an arbiter of choices that had to be made and decisions about the ARPANET and the internet as it later evolved. In due course, and this was probably a few decades later, these functions spun out of ISI and are now being provided by ICANN, the organization that Ron heads, which was stood up by the university with the agreement. Just like when ISI was set up with the agreement of DARPA, this was set up with sort of the agreement with the U.S. government that they wanted something like this in place. And so ISI responded because all of the expertise really did reside in ISI at the time. So that's sort of part of the longer story that you'll hear from Rod with some authority. And then the third one I want to mention is application support. It's too bad that Danny Cohn is here because when I talked to him about what he would have put on the list, what he said was e-commerce, because he felt that ISI made a major contribution to e-commerce. Well, I've never been a fan of E in front of anything because, you know, on fiber optics it's P-commerce and, you know, gravity it will be G-commerce, but the application support on the internet was really something that he was willing to have. So I said, well, could you explicate it? Because I know of a few things, and I listed what I knew. It turned out that was his list, too. So let me mention the first thing on my list would have been the Moses system. And even though many people see that as something that's more in the semiconductor VLSI design arena, and which got started, which I hope Bert will talk about later, with the initial efforts that started at PARC, which then we chimed in and from DARPA and really made it a bigger time national level capability, and which ISI later took internationally. It's one of the premier examples that still is functioning today, but I'm sure there are others, and I'll mention a few others. So there are a lot of individuals in the the networking story. I won't try to name them all. I would probably even have trouble remembering every single one of the names because I met all the people over time. And as I mentioned before, I'm certainly not going to talk about the more recent stuff because I just don't know it from firsthand experience. I do know it anecdotally in some cases, and some of our people have been involved in things, but I want to talk about what I do know. But of the people that I did interact with, I would certainly mention John Postel, who passed away around 1998 or so it's over almost 15 years now. Danny Cohen, who I was surprised he's not here today, but I thought he was. Is Danny? Where's Danny? Danny, okay, good to see you. Fresh from Geneva. Okay. Paul Maka-Petras, Bob Braden, Joyce Reynolds, Richard Bisbee, John Vital, and indeed quite a number of others. Much of the story here is really about the work of individuals, but a good part of it is also about the environment that was created here, which enabled those things to happen. So let me start with environment first. This is a topic that Keith and I discussed on many, many occasions. I believe that he mostly saw ISI as a support organization for DARPA. I think that was his gestalt because that's what he depended on, and for which the university provided an excellent home. At the time, I would say DARPA saw it as a collection of very smart people, knowledgeable about IT, with a national view, because they had come out of a federal R&D center at RAND, who could also help with certain support issues. So I think from the DARPA perspective, they were looking for the research thing primarily, but they could do these support functions, which was great. And I think he saw it as more of a support activity for which maybe we can get some research money too. I haven't polled every single researcher, but I'm sure the researchers really were focused on the research side of things primarily, and what new ideas they could come with and how they could pursue them. In fact, this is a relatively unique combination of kind of research and support, because in many of the other universities, people who got into national levels of support were often minimized in some way of not putting enough time into the university and not doing enough research and not pursuing their own careers well enough. So, and as I mentioned before, and as Herb knows all too well, the climate in Washington eventually changed, and so did DARPA's interests. And so what made sense for DARPA in the early days didn't necessarily make sense anymore. And probably the only thing that really retained itself out of that was the willingness to fund an occasional good idea as it crossed the threshold. And so ISI branched out and went into many other areas. So even though ISI has managed to maintain their DARPA connections over the years, I think they've looked to other things to supplant that DARPA support and open up some new possibilities over the years. Interestingly enough, one of the things that has sustained itself over time was also one of the hardest to really plant deep roots, and that was the MOSES system, which I earlier mentioned that networking had played an important role. The way DARPA gets into funding things, they put in money for a while and they like to get out, a year or two, sort of like, the Red Cross of things. You go in, you give a blood transfusion, and get out. In this case, the infusion was R&D money, create something, transition it, and so here's MOSES. It's now been in operation for 3 or 4 years, and we're hearing from Bob Cooper, who was then the DARPA director, well, when do we stop the funding of this? And we argued very strongly, you can't stop, it's too important. And we had the same issue with regard to all the networking stuff. When the ARPANET was out, we had the same exact issue. And I was the one that worked the transition of ARPANET responsibility to DCA in 1974, took hold in 1975, but DARPA never gave up policy control over it, and DARPA continued to be the funder of it until the time it was later decommissioned, which was in 1990. So the ARPANET stayed around until the NSFNet took hold, and at that point they said, okay, I guess we don't need to do this anymore. It was only 50 kilobits, and NSFNet was starting out at 1.5 megabits. So it looked like the right way to deal with in the future. And besides, DARPA had demonstrated it was time to get out of that and do something else, or so the argument went. Didn't hold for very long at the time, but that was the argument. So this is sort of where we were back then. If you look at DARPA as an organization, really it's a collection of maybe 100, roughly, plus or minus some small multiple, of individuals with each with a big pot of money to invest. And people often say it's this set of 100 individuals linked by a common travel agent that makes the organization up. And I think it's not today quite as true as it once was. In fact, with some of the directors they had, there was one party that was a program manager with a lot of assistants. But I think there's some validity in this statement. And ISI had some of those same qualities as well. So when I dealt with it, I usually dealt with Keith at the level of, well, when are we going to get the proposal and some of the larger issues. But in principle, the people at DARPA dealt with the individual researchers. So it was a Bob Balzer that we dealt with, or it was a Danny Cohn that we dealt with. We did not deal with Keith on these technical matters. Keith was sort of the shepherd for the activity to make sure the power stayed on and the like, but he maintained the integrity of the place. And that was, I think, one of the important reasons that DARPA, was comfortable funding ISI to do many of these support functions as well. I think that some of what ISI did was directly responsible to ARPA needs, and Keith was responsive to that. Most of the research funding was actually from the people themselves who came up with the ideas, put it forth to DARPA, and DARPA supported it. So let me mention one other thing. Let me start with the computational side of the world. This was an area that I kind of associate the name Dan Lynch with. Dan kind of ran that as operational support. He had a very good assistant. Was it Gary McGrail? Is that his name? In any event, in providing this network service, it really took somebody to make it all work. And Dan played that role as well as his staff. One of the important things about that was Dan understood that as we were moving into the world of the internet, where more and more users were going to get access to these kind of services, that we needed to make the TCP/IP protocol much more robust. And he spent quite a bit of his time, I want to say, stress testing and debugging. And this is one of these thankless tasks where in the history of the world, you don't get much credit for saying, I made sure this actually worked. But that's what he did, and I think that was a very important thing that ISI contributed that never make front page headlines, but speaking from a position of knowing what it took to actually make the decision to go forward, it was really important too. Now, the computational facility that ISI ran actually was good for more than just providing good computational support to the research community and to DARPA and ISI, and they actually made money for it. So let me explain how this one worked. Because they were so good at running it, the incremental cost of running one of these machines at ISI was on the order of $150,000, $200,000 a year. That was the additional cost. They had the space, they had the people, one more machine, Fox next. So the Strategic Air Command was headed, the IT part of it was headed by General Evans at the time, and he had decided to go out and get computational support for SAC, Strategic Air Command. And the going commercial service at the time was something on the order of $3,200 to $3,600, $3,600K, $3.2 to $3.6 million a year. That's what it cost to get a dedicated KL machine in those days. Well, ISI could do it for us for like 150 or 200,000. So we saw an opportunity here, and we went to Don and said, look, we can make this available to you for 800,000. Well, he saw it as a big win, all right? It was much cheaper to pay DARPA through some MIPR, some interdepartmental transfer, 800,000, than it was to go commercially and pay 3.6 million. And so we got the 800,000, and this generated almost 600,000 or slightly more as discretionary money that we could spend within the DARPA office. Now, we gave some of that back to ISI to be sure, but it really helped with things that weren't otherwise easy to support. So I thought I'd mention that. There were other operational services they provided. I'll come back to that later. Along with Lincoln Labs and a number of other organizations, ISI pioneered the area of packet voice communications. They kind of represented the networking side of that agenda. These were not, the speech experts. These were not the people who were inventing the new speech algorithms, but trying to figure out how to make it work. And at the time, this was not an objective that most people thought was reasonable. I mean, take a speech stream, which everybody knew how to be continuous at the other end, chop it up into these little packets, scatter them around, like atoms in the universe, then bring them all together and still make it all work. Didn't seem reasonable. It was probably the most visible part of ISI's work on real-time communications over the ARPANET and later the internet more generally. And I'll get into some of the details of that shortly, but I just wanted to point out what the challenge was at the time. The ARPANET was a 50 kilobit network. The algorithms that were easy to get implemented were not yet on chips, but they were implemented with a system called PCM, pulse code modulation. And Danny and Steve Kasner and others worked on some of these real-time protocols in a number of different avenues to try and make it work. Well, how would you send, a 64 kilobit PCM string over the ARPANET? Well, yeah, I guess you might imagine send, every other packet, but it wouldn't have worked very well at the other end when you try to put it together. Probably wouldn't have understood it. And it wasn't until later that some options came out for lower rate devices, like 32 kilobit CDSD, which is, for those of you continuous variable slope delta modulation. And later we got 16 kilobit CDSD, adaptive predictive coding, and eventually linear predictive coding, which worked down as low as 2.4 kilobits per second. And I gave as a challenge to the group, let's see if we can figure out how to get an average communication rate of less than 1,000 bits a second. Well, most people thought that was ridiculous. In fact, we just had a ceremony at Lincoln that awarded an IEEE milestone to those events when we first demonstrated packet voice over the internet. Let me tell you how we convinced ourselves that this was even feasible. There was a gentleman at Lincoln Labs named Jim Forgy who said, why don't we do a simulation of it over the internet, or the ARPANET at that time, and see if this really is an idea that could work. And so Jim's idea was as follows. We'd actually pre-positioned the speech at Lincoln Lab ahead of time. So you didn't really have to send it. But they wouldn't play it out until they got a packet from the source that basically said, okay, time to play this packet. And so the speech would get played out as if it had come over the ARPANET at the right bandwidth, except we didn't know whether the packets would show up, whether they'd be gaps, delays, whether it would sound jerky or whatever. That experiment actually showed that it was possible, even with 50 kilobit kind of networks, to actually send the stuff and put it all together. So in the 50s and 60s, we really didn't have much in the way of high bandwidth anything. It was all basically dial-up if you could even get it, and that really didn't show up until a little later in a really usable form. But by the early 70s, 50 kilobits was considered wideband. But can you imagine sending hundreds or thousands of telephone calls over we were just wondering, could you get one phone conversation over this network alone? One of the things that, I'm going to get into some more of the details here, but one of the things that we created back then to try and help the community deal with this was a wideband satellite network. Involved these dishes that were fairly large in size. We had one here at ISI. I'm going to show you a photo of that in a moment. I looked in my archives to find reasonable photos, and I had a lot of them that were either too degraded to really make good sense. Unfortunately, they weren't digital, but I got a few of them. Some of you will recognize these, and even one that's kind of an impish picture of me that I wasn't going to show, but I got convinced maybe I should. So if we could bring up that, oh, you got it there. So I can do this with this. So, yeah, I do. This arrow is probably forward. Where do I have to point it?
The right arrow.
That's what I'm clicking. Maybe I do some other button. I'll try them. Okay. So I don't know if anybody here recognizes this. This was actually on the roof of the building on Admiralty Way. This was, I think, like a 6-meter dish, which would have been about 18 feet across. And I don't know if you can see it there. Is part of this work as a pointer? How do I do that? Nope. Well, that's me cracking a bottle of, huh? Okay, that's me cracking a bottle of champagne. Yeah, that's just Keith's way of doing things. I mean, when we brought it in. Let me see if I can go back one. Okay, that's the picture of the antenna. If you look very carefully, let me see if this will work. I don't think, oh, it's the other way around, okay. See that guy there? Yeah. That's Keith in his Natalie dressed outfit. Let's see, that's me right here. You can't tell. That, although you can't tell, is Bob Balzer. And I'm not sure who else is in the picture. That could be Steve Kastner. Is that you?
It looks reasonable.
Yeah. And I'm sure Danny's in there somewhere, but I can't pick him out of there right now. So this was this antenna we put up on the roof. Let me tell you how hard it was to get this antenna on the roof. I'm not talking about the cranes and that stuff. The California Coastal Commission said no way, because these antennas were considered a blight on the landscape. They wouldn't let it happen. So we were looking for other places. There was a GTE facility on, down a block or two from Mindanao. They were going to put it on the roof. Then the question was, how do we get the bandwidth over to ISI? We looked at all kinds of opportunities. And finally, it prevailed, and they went ahead and agreed to let us put the thing up there. And ISI used it for a lot of experimentation with other places. There were not that many, so this was not, this was not millions of nodes, but I think we had at least a half a dozen. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Let's see if this will work. Okay, that's me with the, there were all kinds of, dinners and stuff that would happen. Keith would always have celebrations for this or that. I don't know, they were 40th anniversaries, but they might have been a 5th anniversary or a 10th one. So this is, I guess, oops. That's Danny Cohn there, and that's a youthful Steve Crocker. Let's see, who else we got? Anybody recognize that? That's a youthful Vince Cerf. These were all pictures that were clipped out of bigger ones, and I could have gone back into the archives and figured out what was around there, but I'm only going to show you one clip. It's kind of embarrassing for me, but I will show it to you anyway. And this was one that was Keith at some ceremony. There were all kinds of other people there who I didn't recognize, so when we did, this was done years ago, that's because the quality is so bad. That was what Keith looked like back then. And this was one more. That's, again, Vint and his wife Sigrid Keith, his wife Doris, and Steve Crocker. And then I said, I wonder where that was taken, because I seem to remember that one. So I went back, and guess what? A little embarrassing. I felt a little impish there, but there you go. Okay, so just for, I've got more. I'm going to try and find them and get them to her for ISI's records. So let me go back into this speech side of things and tracking my time here. We started about 20 of by my watch, so if I need to get stopped earlier, let me know. So I want to go back to the time Danny and I met at Harvard, way back when. Danny had been doing some graphics experiments. Bert was actually involved in some early graphics experiments. Remember the air traffic simulation stuff? Well, Danny had been doing some of the early real-time graphics stuff back at Harvard, between Harvard and MIT over the ARPANET. And we were just trying to get the speech program going. I thought Danny could really contribute to that. And we had a discussion about it. And he ended up going to ISI. Whether my conversation with him had any impact on that, hard to know. But I recall those conversations. We had just done these experiments with Jim Forgey, and so I knew about it. When Danny got involved, one of the things that he decided to do was jump into the protocol arena, which he's been involved with really in many ways for a very long time. Most people don't quite appreciate how much Danny contributed to some of the internet protocol development. But when we did the original TCP/I work, all the IP stuff was bundled in. And we had some discussion about whether to pull it out, leave it in. And Danny was one of the main pioneers that pushed for pulling it out. I think in retrospect, it was exactly the right choice. But that was one thing he did. He was the prime author of the network voice protocol, which made it possible to do real-time communications. And that was what made all of these early packetized voice experiments actually work. It was a start. ISI later demonstrated its application to packet video. I remember demonstrations that Steve and Danny gave to me at ISI over the years. And one of the most interesting things about the network voice protocol was that it was one of the first protocols actually implemented that involved the notion of negotiation. So because you had all these different ways to code things, one of the things it did was say, you know, essentially, can you talk LPC 2.5? No, it's too, no, can't do that. How about PCM? No, I'm sorry, no bandwidth. How about, you know, APC or LPC? They actually negotiated for how to talk together over that protocol. And my guess is there's a message in there, because I think that could have had a major impact on how a lot of the applications work with each other if it were extended higher up into the application stack. I think while LPC didn't quite come in back then, it did eventually later due to much work by others at Bell Labs, BBN, and other places. But what my understanding is that much of what you have in Skype today is essentially a lineal descendant of the work that was done here at ISI. And Skype is now in very widespread use around the world and basically works on essentially the same principles. Finally, in terms of graphics, I mentioned, you know, the early work that was done on real-time graphics. One of the things that ISI did is it pioneered the notion of machine-independent graphics. And a lot of the early graphics experiments, you know, the two sides knew exactly how to deal with each other. But if you're trying to send out graphics and you don't know what machine is going to get it or what application is going to present it, you needed a way to sort of extract it. It was one of the key parameters of protocol development, that you wanted the stuff over the net where it was in widespread use by many parties to be as independent of anything as you can. So the Telnet protocol worked like that, and the FTP protocols worked like that. But ISI really pioneered how to do machine-independent graphics, and I think, was it Richard Bisbee that was one of the key people working on that? And it was probably involved other people as well. But sort of everything that happened at ISI happened in such a collegial fashion that it's hard to point to one person and say they were the ones that were responsible and no one else. What most of the world knows about ISI and networking is its contribution to the DNS, which is widely used in the internet today. This was developed at ISI. It was the work really of Paul Macapetris and John Postel, but there may have been other contributions to that as well, but that's what I know about what came out of it. This was really critical because I managed the transition from the old NCP protocol to the TCP/IP protocol, and knowing that we could do that really meant that the DNS had to work. We were now talking about not 100 machines on the ARPANET, which you could figure out where they were and what their ARPANET addresses were by downloading this host.txt file from SRI, but we now had the potential for, I want to think large, tens of thousands of machines by then, and how we could do that without having people download these very large files was really important. So they proposed 7 generalized domain names, all familiar to you today, the .coms and .nets and so forth. I could tell you a little bit about the .arpa domain, but I think I will hold that off. We actually set the template, but that was not a result of having a system behind it. This was just a simple way that we introduced at DARPA. And in fact, when I say we, this was really something that I did just to make it easy to make use of the host.txt file. So if you addressed something like Postel at ISI, it meant obviously John, but use the NCP protocol. And if you called it John or Postel at isi.arpa, what it meant was use IPv, what became IPv4 addresses, essentially use the same darn host.txt file, just take the ARPANET address and plunk it into the 32-bit IP address because there was room. And so that's how it would go through the internet, and when it got to wherever it was going, that it would be understood again. So the actual introduction of the 7 GTLDs were actually 2 through 8 in the analysis of that. So this service that ISI provided, I would describe as more bookkeeping and librarian services back then. Nobody thought it was very sexy. It certainly wasn't very economic, although it later turned out to be the most economic thing about the network. And this particularly became important after the U.S. government allowed the NSF net to be opened up to the public. So another interesting observation about that, Ray Tomlinson is credited widely with having introduced the @ sign into addressing. When Tim Berners-Lee went into the web conventions, he actually reversed it. So domain names now came first, file names came later. It would be like addressing something to isi.arpa at John or at Postel. So it was sort of the inverse of that. Just want to try and get to the end of this pretty quickly because I know time is going by. Another thing that was a major contribution of ISI was its formulation of the IANA as a function. Most people don't know much about this or even what it does, even though they know a lot about the DNS and IP addresses. But, you know, and Rod may get into this as well, but, you know, John and ISI more generally, you know, developed a lot of the standards and protocols and procedures for managing these things. And it's really an important function right to this very day, but not very well understood by others. Very important contribution. ISI took the lead in championing a local network here in the Los Angeles area called Los Netos. This was at a time when, you know, NSF's network had now become de rigueur and the ARPANET was being decommissioned, and that NSF net only went to a handful of places. So in order to broaden out the connectivity, they were encouraging these local nets. And ISI played a lead role in simulating it. I think they actually ran much of that functionality for a long time. But this was an important community contribution. And finally, I would point out the contributions that ISI has made to this area of, can I call it, digital commerce for the moment. The first of these is Moses. And while I had some peripheral connection to it and was in fact the program manager initially, this was really an ISI-led effort. It derived from work that started at Xerox PARC, and I hope Bert will tell you what some of that was. But for a variety of reasons, it needed to move out of PARC, and we made it possible to happen here, and Danny injected himself into that in a major way. I think he actually spent time with Carver Mead over at Caltech, getting the neurons spun up on what that was really all about. But it's a premier example of something that was really hard to establish, but now is really fairly well rooted and is, continues to be important support activity for the community. The last funded effort that I signed out of DARPA before I left at the end of '85 was an effort that ISI developed and continues to this day, I believe, to run, was called FAST. And I actually saw it initially as an extension of Moses. I thought it was a good idea. And it was something that actually helped folks to design and fabricate parts that Moses helped them design parts that didn't exist before, so they could fabricate them anew. But FAST really wanted to help people acquire parts that did exist. So in that sense, it was kind of a forerunner to eBay, things like that. And I have a description of what ISI used to describe it, but I won't go into that due to lack of time. But let me simply say that this system was actually used during the Gulf War to assist the DoD in acquiring parts that it needed for a particular capability, for which I believe ISI actually got a letter of commendation from the Secretary of Defense. So this is yet another thing that was both technical for the community and was of national security help along the way. So really in summary, I would say ISI has had a remarkable record of success over the years. And when they undertake an initiative, they usually succeed, at least technically. But sometimes politics gets in the way. And the only effort that I was aware of that ISI got involved with, which actually did not succeed for lack of good technical capability. It was actually a technical success. But the project was called the Military Message Experiment. And there were other organizations involved. I think BBN was involved with its version of Hermes at the time. And of course, John Vitale had done some pioneering work at ISI here on message systems that could work over the internet. The problem had arisen, I got directly involved in this, so I can tell you from personal experience that there was a committee in Congress called the Moynihan Committee that had learned in the late 1960s that there were, it's like the Casablanca thing, there's gambling going on. They had learned that there were 96 communication centers on the island of Oahu. Now, any of you who have ever traveled to the island of Oahu, you can drive from one end to the other in a few hours, so 96 seemed a little large for them. Well, it turned out that these consisted of 24 different locations, which is still a lot of locations, but each location had an Army center, a Navy center, an Air Force center, and a Marine Corps center. So there were 4 centers at each of 24 locations for 24 different comm centers, and the Congress's concern was about the unnecessary expenditure for running all these different comm centers. So this led to a project called COTCO, Consolidation of Telecommunication Centers on Oahu. That was what the acronym was. So the bureaucracy quickly took over in Washington, and what it said was they would look into the matter, that's what they told the Congress, and they get back to them, with their analysis of the situation. But I'll have to repair that in a moment. But the interesting thing was that 4 or 5 years later, the problem still hadn't been resolved. And when I showed up at DARPA, which was at the end of 72, sometime around then, possibly even early 73, this issue showed up on my desk to prepare a response. What should we tell the Congress? Well, we've been looking at it for 5 years or something. Nobody had a clue. What do we do? And I thought that maybe some combination of ARPANET technology coupled with what ISI was starting to demonstrate, or the computational center stuff, would provide a solution. We could do time-sharing services. Because every one of those centers was somehow connected into Autodin 1 back then, and so forth. And I talked to Keith about it, and he became incredibly enthusiastic. This was another example of ISI support to what he considered DARPA. I think the thinking at the time was that all but 1 or 2 of these centers could now be shut down, because you'd only need 1 or 2 places that had the connectivity, and everybody could dial in with remote terminals. So there was a competition. Steve Walker actually became the program manager at DARPA, and DARPA funded this experiment, and ISI essentially provided the test system out there, and it was actually a very workable system. They succeeded admirably technically. So that's one of the reasons I felt comfortable telling you about it, because this was a technical success. But the politics torpedoed it. Politics issue number 1, a lot of the people in the higher-up didn't like this solution because it allowed people down at the grassroots to bypass the local command and go right to folks in Washington. So that was not good. Number 2, the Navy was concerned that at the end of this whole session, they might actually have to pick up the tab. DARPA was paying 100% for it, and they didn't want to have to pay for this. And in fact, they said they didn't have any money. And then finally, and this was probably the most important thing by far, that it would have made the case that they didn't need all those other comm centers. And the Navy was worried about losing the slots, the people. So what to do? DARPA had done its part. We fueled this thing. We showed them what to do. We could create a good response back to the Moynihan Committee and say, here's a great technical solution, but the Navy wouldn't sign up for it. So it never went back that way. And yet the committee was anxiously awaiting for this plan. So what to do? ISI had clearly demonstrated a workable solution, I thought. And it may very well have influenced the out-year Navy plans, but it was shut down despite its technical success. The plan that actually went back to the Congress, can anybody guess the bureaucracy and how it would respond to this? They don't want to lose the slots. They got 96 centers. Congress wants them to cut back. So the report back said they would reduce the number of centers from 96 to 24. Remember, there were 24 locations. And the way they did it was by knocking down the partitions. Nothing else changed. The Moynihan Committee was wildly enthusiastic. They got 96 down to 24. The Navy was happy they kept their slots, and the only thing that didn't happen was the good technical solution went forward. So, problem solved for the DoD. So I guess if there's a moral here, I would say it's that ISI really does best when it can focus on its intrinsic capabilities and avoid politics wherever it's possible. And I suspect that this was a lesson that the university learned years later when it decided to create ICANN. Because one of the reasons was the incredible amount of politics that was starting to show up with the increased usage around the world and all of the complaints and potential lawsuits that were on the horizon. And of course, I'm going to put words in Rod's mouth and say ICANN thrives in the world of politics. It's sort of almost all they do that really is substantive, and I think they've done it. They have done exceedingly well in that regard, because we know that it just takes a handful of people to just do the technical thing on the side. It's all the politics that's everything. It's dealing with all the countries around the world. It's dealing with all of the issues that are fraught with, U.S. government involvement versus not. And they have done an admirable job. I want to say it here. I tell the rest of the world, leave them alone. Let them just do what they do. So for ISI, as far as I'm concerned, even though I've only addressed the networking side of the issues, I'd like to congratulate all of you, everyone here in the room and those that couldn't make it, who have made so many remarkable contributions over 40 years, not only to research in the various research areas, but also for your contributions to public service. So thank you very much. Okay.
Just a little memento. Thank you for coming. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Yep, you bet.
So I guess I could say at this point, Rod needs no introduction. So Rod Beckstrom is the president and CEO of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. As a global organization charged with keeping the Internet secure, stable, and interoperable, interoperable. Sorry, that was a mistake. This isn't your day, is it? So ICANN employs a unique, open, multi-stakeholder model to promote policy development for the Internet's unique identifiers. Prior to joining ICANN, Rod served as director of the United States National Cybersecurity Center, responsible for coordinating Internet security policy across 6 cybersecurity centers in the civilian, military, and intelligence communities. Rod writes and speaks on technological, cybersecurity, organizational strategy, and leadership. He has co-authored 4 books, including Starfish and the Spider, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations, which was published in more than 20 languages. Rod's entrepreneurial career started when he established his first company at 24 and later took it public on the NASDAQ. Rod, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I guess we've got to have a politician at every event. It really is an incredible honor to be here with all of you to celebrate the ISI's 40th anniversary. And really, I'm just here to recognize your tremendous accomplishments and contributions to the world of information sciences, computing, and networking. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I think in many ways, the role of ICANN is that ICANN is one of the organizations that carries forth some of the torches that you lit here at ISI and that Bob helped light with his initial work and research. And it's a great honor to do that. And I think that if we think about the politics and geopolitics, and the reality is that ICANN is in the middle of tremendous levels of political and geopolitical issues around the internet, the real role and goal is to protect the torch of the unique identifiers from inappropriate influences that would fracture the internet and harm the global unity of the internet we enjoy today. Thanks very much to your efforts. And I want to thank you, Herb Shore, for the wonderful invitation to come and join today. And I'm sure that your pending departure from your current role will leave some very large shoes to fill for the organization. When I received the invitation from Herb, I seized upon it just as an opportunity to come and express our gratitude at ICANN for you helping to create our organization and for hosting us in your building for so many years. And when I think of ICANN and all of our development, we can just never forget that we stand on the shoulders of many giants. And many of you who've contributed to these thoughts and remarks today. I owe a special debt of gratitude to Bob Kahn, and I'm honored that he took time to review my remarks and thoughts today, and more importantly, he's been an invaluable mentor to me over the past 5 years since I served as a senior advisor to the DNI and then ran the U.S. National Cyber Center and then took the role at ICANN. Bob has always been there as a trusted, brilliant founder of the internet, there to help someone who cares deeply about the internet to do their job. So thank you, Bob. The organizers asked me to speak about the history of ISI and ICANN, and they've also asked me to talk a bit about the future of the internet. In my role as president and CEO, I have many speaking engagements that are forward-looking and related to the current policy issues. And there's opportunities to talk about our work and how it'll usher in the next phase of a global unified internet that many of you have helped to create. Today, in speaking about the past, I have an opportunity to reflect on ISI's foundational work and, as I mentioned, to convey a message of awe and gratitude at what you've accomplished. With that in mind, I hope you'll bear with me if much of the tale I'll be telling is already known to you because you helped to shape it. And I hope that you'll allow me some editorial license if you detect any inaccuracy. I know I'm addressing a very, very knowledgeable crowd. And now for some history. George Becky has done an excellent job of describing how ISI was born. And now I'd like to jump back a few years to before ISI was founded in 1968, when computer networking was an idea and not a proven concept. That year, ARPA wanted to see if a network of different computers could be created. They sent out a request for quotation to build a network of 4 interface messaging processors, or IMPs, or IMPs, I guess as you say, that would allow this to be done through telephone lines. These packet switches were the predecessor to what we would later call gateways or routers. A team at Bolt, Beranek & Newman, or BBN Technologies, won the proposal. A background piece on their website today says at the time, many of their large computer and telecommunications companies didn't even want to bid on this project. They didn't think that it could be done. But BBN proved it could be done in less than 1 year. They built and delivered the first IMPs to 4 universities. Do you say IMPs or IMPs? What's the preference? IMPs? Great. And by 1971, the network had expanded to 13 sites. From such humble beginnings, the revolution of mass communication began. ISI's own Bob Braden, while at another Los Angeles university, had the technical responsibility of attaching UCLA's IBM 360/91 supercomputer to the ARPANET in 1970. Bob, I believe you're in the audience, but we haven't met yet. Oh. Great. Very nice to meet you, sir. At an international conference in Washington, D.C. in October 1972, researchers proved that networking between once incompatible computers was possible via the ARPANET, one of the world's first packet switching networks. It was only the beginning of a network population boom that stretched beyond the United States and into France, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and other countries. So it was that ISI was created just as the computer networking focus shifted to solving the problem of how to make these different computer networks talk to one another. Bob Kahn of DARPA worked with Vint Cerf of Stanford University to figure out how to unify these packet switching networks that use telephone lines, radios, satellite, as we saw with a dish on your roof there, or cable to connect with one another. They even recruited a couple of Vint's high school buddies, Steve Crocker and John Postel. They worked out a solution, and Kahn and Cerf first presented their ideas and later published them via the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, the IEEE. They called it internetworking. Today, we call the resulting global information system that has now become ubiquitous, the internet. There's an old saying about success having many fathers. The history of the internet is still being written, but in most versions, you'll hear the same names: Vint Cerf, Danny Cohen, Steve Crocker, Bob Kahn, Leonard Kleinrock, John Postel, Larry Roberts. If I tried to list them all, we'd be here for hours. The Internet Society's new Internet Hall of Fame takes a stab at it, with 33 inductees named earlier this week. Can I see who in the room was attending and on that list? Yes. Wonderful. ISI researchers such as Danny Cohen, Steve Crocker, now the chairman of ICANN, John Postel, and Paul Makapatris figure prominently. Surf and Kahn's solution for internetworking brought order to the chaos of disparate networks, but someone had to maintain that order by recording and preserving the protocols, the identifiers, the networks, the addresses, and the names of every outpost in the network world. That person was John Postel of ISI. As a graduate student, he was one of the first to join a research project to build the ARPANET. Afterwards, he spent 21 years of his too-short career at the Institute. When Postel joined ISI, he brought with him the responsibility for two lists he had begun keeping while at UCLA. And I understand from Bob Kahn, Bob says that first list was kept on a green 3x5 card, just like this. On his 3x5 card, that I guess, did you hand it to John Postel? No, I just gave him the responsibility. And you kept the card. All right. And so he brought those responsibilities with him when he came to ISI from UCLA. And one was a list of ARPANET host names and addresses, and the other was the index of requests for comment papers written by ARPANET researchers. Let's talk about the list of host names and addresses first. In the early days, ARPANET and other networks were like small towns. Everyone knew everyone else. The informal structure of networks reflected that familiarity. According to internet lore, the various individuals in the ARPANET kept their own lists of addresses on scraps of paper, like the one we showed, or maybe even a pocket notebook. Kahn kept his list, as we discussed. If you want to find someone on the network, you looked up their address in your list and you typed in that number. As these networks expanded, paper lists were replaced by text files, but even these had the potential to become an operational nightmare. Host tables were still working, even though the number of internet hosts had soared from dozens to thousands. But the files needed updating daily, and everyone in each network was uploading it each night. The potential for error was high. For those involved, it wasn't difficult to envision a future where simple text file was no longer the right tool for the job. In 1982, Postel asked a member of his ISI research team, Paul Makapatris, to devise a new way of assigning and keeping track of internet addresses across different networks. The solution was truly brilliant. Building from a general .ARPA notation system introduced in the 1970s, the new system was based on the numerical designations, but it allowed a user to reach a computer by a human-friendly name as well. It was hierarchical and distributed. Very starfishy in my terms, highly decentralized. It classified top-level domains into 7 or 8 different categories, like the U.S. government site at .gov or universities at .edu, and I presume you were perhaps one of the first, if not the first on .edu. Of the 7 new top-level domains, .com was the least important at the time. That was because the internet was off-limits to private companies until the early 1990s. Today, .com is by far the largest, with more than 100 million registered second-level domain names. This combination of decentralized architecture with minimal centralized control is a clear handprint of Postel's involvement with Makapatris, and one reason why the internet has scaled so well. They built the original DNS to support 50 million plus entries. Today, it has been expanded and internationalized, and we estimate that it holds more than 225 million domain names across all the TLDs. New GTLDs could add millions more, or maybe even billions someday, but the system will remain stable and secure thanks to the design and architecture created by Postel and Makapatris for DARPA while they were here at ISI. I mentioned that Postel brought over 2 lists from UCLA. The second list was a series of papers called Requests for Comment. Thanks to this list, an archaeologist interested in excavating the history of the ARPANET doesn't have to dig too far. They just have to find the old paper files and black leather-bound logbooks kept at ISI. Through 2009, the network division of ISI was the home of the RFC editor function, with Bob Braden and Joyce Reynolds at the editor's helm after Postel's passing. The first RFC, written by ICANN's current board chairman, Steve Crocker, in 1969, was a humble first volley aimed at starting a dialogue about applications and protocols for the ARPANET. Over decades, these documents have become the mainstay for sharing technological designs in the internet community and an archetype for other communities as well. Today, there are more than 6,500 RFCs searchable online in many different formats. So the internet was built as an open architecture. Anyone could and still can contribute to its operation. Membership in the organizations that define its standards and protocols is open. And I'm sure many of you are key contributors to the IETF, among other groups. Because of its open nature, there are many birthdays and many milestones you can point to in its evolution. Many people consider ARPANET's January 1983 transition to the Internet Protocol Suite, or TCP/IP, the actual birthday of the Internet as we know it. But even that transition wasn't exactly one day. It actually took about 6 months to complete. The fact is that the Internet has had many important, game-changing beginnings. We talked about how the Internet evolved from a DARPA concept into a real operational network, able to link different computers around the world. And that brings us into the 1980s. Computer networking has started out as a pure research project, primarily driven by DARPA with the goal of learning if and how it could be done. And by the 80s, researchers knew what could be done, and they had the know-how. The Internet opened for broader use at universities, U.S. military, and U.S. government sites. And now the focus was on what should come next. In 1980, a little more than 150 host computers were connecting some 20,000 researchers, scientists, military, and government. The personal computer was introduced in 1981, and it's found its way into many offices, schools, and homes, so much that Time magazine dubbed it the Machine of the Year in 1982. The computer was the first non-human to be Time's Person of the Year. More computers meant more people on the internet. And by 1989, there were 200,000 host computers, and more commercial networks emerged. The internet had earned its place as a truly viable communications technology. And as the 80s turned to the 90s, researchers at CERN in Geneva, Switzerland, were working on the concept of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee and his colleagues transformed the internet from a mechanism for delivering files to a web of information that internet users could retrieve and view. In 1992, a group of students and researchers at the University of Illinois and others working around the world worked on a new technology in terms of browsers. And at the University of Illinois, they called theirs Mosaic, later to be known as Netscape. Mosaic offered users a friendly way to search the web and allowed users to navigate using scroll bars and clickable links, many thanks to Bert and others and all the work at Xerox PARC, words and pictures throughout the same page. And it awakened commercial interest in the internet far beyond the research of Xerox PARC, IBM, CERN, Cisco Systems, and others who'd played a role in its early development. That same year, Congress passed the Information Infrastructure and Technology Act of 1992. Was that when Al Gore invented the internet? Which opened the internet for commercial purposes. What followed was a huge infusion of commercial investment as companies of all kinds hurried up to get websites of their own, and e-commerce entrepreneurs began to use the internet to sell goods directly to customers. Sounds like they learned a lot from the Moses system that you helped to pioneer. The number of machines tapping the internet exploded, where once the growth rate had doubled each year, now it was closer to doubling each quarter. Assigning internet names and IP addresses was no longer a small activity, as you no doubt knew from the hectic activity on the 11th floor of your offices. The Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, or IANA, was established informally as a reference to various technical functions of ARPANET. John Postel and Joyce Reynolds performed the function at UCLA and later ISI. To deal with the influx of computers onto the net, IANA became a more formal entity with John Postel as its director. A formalized IANA gave the internet stability and robustness by assigning and managing in an orderly fashion the unique numbers and names of the domain name system. IANA allocated blocks of numerical addresses to regional registries throughout the world, which in turn assigned them to internet service providers, corporations, and users. IANA also managed a registry of values for several thousand technical parameters, including protocol numbers, port numbers, and other units that had to be unique for the internet to operate. By this time, the IANA function was nearly synonymous with Postel. In 1997, The Economist magazine proclaimed, "If the net does have a god, he is probably John Postel." From his corner office, and what's now in your ISI building, and was then, Postel ruled by delegation, encouraging parties to work out disputes among themselves. He found volunteers at universities to manage country code top-level domains all around the world. Bob Kahn tells a story about how he received a call from Postel about a problem with a country code operator in Jordan. It seemed the king of Jordan wanted to know why Postel had assigned management of their country code top-level domain to a certain individual at one of their universities. Kahn's advice was to tell the office of the king of Jordan to work directly with the individual and let them know the outcome. The king listened. The result, the office of the king ultimately selected the same man Postel had assigned. Problem solved. But the hot seat Postel and ISI had been sitting on was about to get hotter. Business users, non-commercial users like academics, nonprofits, and civil society, governments and individuals, many from outside the United States, were voicing concerns about how this important facet of the global information network was governed. Lawsuits were being filed or threatened over disputed domain names, as you well know. It was time for academia and research to disengage from the operation of the commercial internet. Discussion and debate roared around the world. Internet and intellectual property groups formed an international ad hoc committee to create and implement policies and procedures for generic top-level domains. The Clinton administration's Electronic Commerce Initiative in 1997 laid out the U.S. goal to make online trade safe and stable, and its commitment to work with other nations while technology was still in its infancy. Part of this framework included direction from the Secretary of Commerce to privatize the domain name system in a manner that would increase competition and facilitate international participation in its management. The U.S. government released two discussion papers, the Green Paper and the White Paper. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you helped to edit those, outlining ideas for the technical management of internet names and addresses. ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, was born out of that white paper, published in June of 1998. 1998. The dot-com boom is on, and the World Wide Web is exploding with content. Website directories turned into search engines and then morphed again into portals like Yahoo, which combine news, email, and instant messaging. The first Google index was published that year and contained 26 million web documents. Academics had outgrown the internet. University researchers, including ones from ISI, collaborated on a new backbone network called Internet 2. It was built to meet the bandwidth needs of supercomputers and support high-performance applications like medical imaging and particle physics. It also provided a sandbox for innovation separate from the commercial internet. Commerce had revolutionized the use of the internet in the 1990s. Year over year, trade on the internet doubled or tripled. But in many ways, electronic commerce was like the Wild West of the global economy, and the market valuations of many dot-com companies reflected that. One of ICANN's first actions was to concentrate on increasing competition in the registration of domain names, which had up until that point been controlled by DARPA and the U.S. Department of Defense, via SRI primarily, and then by others when the National Science Foundation assumed responsibility. In 1999, ICANN accredited 34 registrars, and over time, this brought the price of registering a domain name down from about $35 per year to about $7, or an 80% drop in price. ICANN has also facilitated greater online competition and innovation through the introduction of several new top-level domains, such as .aero and .biz. Remember the story about the King of Jordan asking how a certain person was appointed to run a country's TLD? Now with the formation of ICANN, his government, and all governments, had a seat at the Internet governance table through ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee, which today has more than 110 members. The Wild West era of the domain name industry was over. The netizens were self-regulating, and they brought a new sheriff to town, ICANN. If the 1990s was the decade in which commerce discovered the Internet, then the 2000s were when individuals discovered its potential for social interaction. Napster taught the world about peer-to-peer file sharing. Music swapping was rampant. The iPod allowed us to take our music collection anywhere. Blogging applications made everyone a content publisher, and podcasts that made them more like broadcasters. Wikipedia, MySpace, Facebook, Yelp, and YouTube launched their websites. Thousands and thousands of online games competed against one another in the online world of Warcraft. It was the era of individuals on the internet, and the whole world was going online. By 2010, there would be 5 times as many internet users as there were in 2000. And it wasn't just that it was getting larger. Internet users were also becoming more spread out geographically, more global. After years of debate, ICANN introduced a new body designed to be the voice of the individual internet user, called the at-large community. This important change to the ICANN community acknowledged the growth and increasing role played by the individual in the Internet's adoption. With more individuals and more commerce on the Internet, cybersecurity moved to the forefront. In 2003, ISI collaborated with UC Berkeley to create the Deter Cybersecurity Facility. It later became the world's shared research facility for security technology development. But more on that later. There's an important issue in the history of the Internet that I've not addressed yet. And to give you context for that, I need to take you back to the 70s and 80s when Pastel was headed from SRI to ISI, and TCP/IP was now a success. Pastel contributed to and documented the standard Internet Protocol version 4, or IPv4, and RFC 791. IPv4 was a descendant of the original IPv4 version that Cerf and Kahn had worked on with some additional functionality, and it has become the dominant protocol ever since. IPv4 and its predecessors used a 32-bit address structure to allow for roughly 4 billion IP addresses. To Cerf and Kahn, it seemed like plenty at the time. According to Kahn, they thought there'd perhaps be dozens of networks around the world and a limit of 16 million machines. And remember when they started working on this, the Ethernet and the personal computer had not yet been introduced. But as the years went on and as connectivity grew, and by the way, I think of your Hawaii story with moving the 96 sites down to 24. We all know what networking is about, right? Tearing down walls. So that was the quick and dirty method. Easier than developing new protocols. All you need is a sledgehammer. But when they started working on it, it was a very different world. And that's, of course, when engineers at ISI and other places began to work on Internet Protocol version 6, or IPv6. Fast forward 3 decades, not only have we gained 3 billion people on the planet, but the Internet's rapid expansion has claimed those 4 billion addresses once thought to be more than plenty. And we had a ceremony in Miami, Florida last February when I handed out certificates representing the last address blocks, and Elise Garrick was there with me, and she's our vice president of the IANA function. Please raise your hand, Elise. Yeah. But we handed out those last address blocks to the 5 regional internet registries, and ICANN and the central facility has no more. But as we look at the profusion of devices today, most devices need an address for connectivity. And mobile devices, smartphones, and tablets will account for 4 out of 5 broadband connections in just 4 years by 2016. And that's the driver for moving to IPv6 at the present time. IPv6 vastly increases the number of unique internet addresses, where IPv4 provided roughly 4 billion. As you know, IPv6 supports roughly 340 trillion, far more than the total number of stars in the observable universe, far more than 1 trillion for every single individual on the planet Earth. So, I'm sorry? For now. For now. It depends on how long the now is. It'd be a long now or a short now. Yeah, we'll see. I think it's a really interesting question to see how quickly we consume those with instruments, devices, sensors, and all the other wizardry that I'm sure you're working on at ISI. And as you know, the broader internet community, led by many people here at ISI, is working on helping to deploy IPv6 globally and to make that move and transition happen. And so it's interesting for me to hear today the early transition from the ARPANET to IPv4 that Bob spoke about. So let's talk about the future a little bit. The organizers of today's seminar wanted me to spend the bulk of my time on history of the internet and ISI's important role and in continuing revolution, but they also wanted me to talk a little bit about the future. And that's one of my favorite topics as a student of the future, which I think we all can be. And I've talked a little bit about the globalization of the internet, but I have a few more statistics to share with you about how internationalized it's become. Developing nations are witnessing the most rapid growth of information and communication technologies. That growth is bringing the potential for innovation, increased productivity, education, and greater competitiveness. And it's connecting more people to one another. It's estimated that more than 5 billion additional people will connect to the internet in the next 20 years, and most of those newcomers will not speak English. And as these new users come online, by the way, here's an interesting research question and topic. We all talk about 2 billion users of the internet, or over 2 billion now. That's really based on computer users of the internet, okay? And some of the smartphones. We're not counting all the people using texting, SMS, and many other services around the world that are depending upon IP. It'd be very interesting for someone to actually determine or estimate how many billions of people in the world have devices in their pocket or on their desk that use the internet for communication. And I think it's a much higher number than that 2 billion number that is often bandied about. But when I've talked to people in telcos, they're not really sure. So it's an interesting research question, I think. But half the internet users today, slightly over half, are in Asia. And approximately 500 million, or 25%, are in China. And that's why internationalized domain names are so important. And as you know, we began to introduce those into the root of the internet over the last 2 years, and now more than 20 countries are represented with their country codes in Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, et cetera. And I have to tell you, for those people in those parts of the world, even though the absolute number of domain names registered is not that great, it means a lot to them to be able to type domain names entirely in their native scripts. And it builds their adoption, or builds their level of satisfaction with the stewardship of the unique identifiers. And ICANN and IANA's role in the global internet technical community gets much greater buy-in because thanks to the work of many people over roughly 15 years that we've been able to do that. And of course, as you know, we're opening up a new GTLD program right now, and one of its aspects is it includes internationalized domain names. It's by far the largest opening of the domain name system at the top level in ICANN's history, or in the internet's history, and it's not without controversy. Of course, what that ICANN does is ever without controversy. If you find it, let me know. I think in many ways, I have a tremendous appreciation for what John Postel did while he was here at ISI, because here he was an academic and doing research and participating in so much, and he had to deal with so many of these issues. The threats of lawsuits, the fights over domain names, the fights over CCTLD control. And I know what that hot seat's like because I sit in it today. And the internet is scaled with so many more domain names and so much more pressure internationally. But it gives me a tremendous appreciation for what he did and the values that he brought to that job of respecting others, of delegating disputes wherever he could and issues to local internet community, really set the values up for the global internet today. And I know that John's values were so much developed by what you've done and what ISI represents and the generations of what has gone on here. So, and what I focus on as a CEO at ICANN has been strengthening the institution. And I have the fortune of having sat on the board of another roughly $100 million nonprofit organization for 18 years, Environmental Defense Fund, which is a bipartisan policy group. and run private companies, public companies, and worked in government. And in my view, we had to make sure we built up the institution's capabilities, recruiting great people like Elise Garrick, like Christopher Mondini, my chief of staff, formerly with State Department. We hired one of the senior internet architects in China and the CTO of Scenic to be our VP of Asia. We've hired leaders in Europe to be the Vice President of Europe. Hired Dr. Whitfield Diffie, a leader in cryptography. Hired Jeff Moss, the world's one of the world's best-known hackers, as our Chief Security Officer, and really upgrading the organization so we can deliver the services we need to scale with the demands that the world brings to it. And it's been an incredible thrill and a great challenge. Because if I'm to talk about cybersecurity for just a moment, and I just want to share, as we all know, getting our head around that topic is fascinating because this world is so virtual, so in-dimensional, and in many ways so indescribable, and yet so real and so connected to the real world. But when I talk about the cyber topic, I first say, I call them Beckstrom's laws. The two laws when I look at the internet is say, anything attached to a network can be hacked, and everything is being attached to networks. And the rest follows. And that means that cybersecurity is one of the greatest challenges that we face on the earth right now, and I know you're making very important contributions to. And we've done our little piece at ICANN by taking the work from the technical community and signing the root of the internet with DNSSEC. But I think as we go forward, one of the concepts that I think about is in the nuclear age, which transformed our politics, our geopolitics, our warfare, and everything. We moved to MAD, but MAD meant mutual assured destruction. In the cyber age, we're also moving to MAD, but MAD has a different meaning. It's mutual assured disruption, because we have the ability, and parties, even asymmetrically, have abilities to wield incredible disruption upon other societies or companies, countries, military bodies. So it's an exciting world. There's a lot that we're going into, and I've run slightly over my time, but I just want to say again how deeply honored I am to be here with you today, how deeply grateful the global internet community is to you, those 2 billion users, plus the billions on phones, for what you've contributed to making it all possible. So thank you very, very much, and congratulations.